definition of vigilantism is law enforcement undertaken without legal authority by a self-appointed group of people. In today's episode, we're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to take you through a number of cases, each involving different types of vigilantism. We'll look at a mother grateful that her son's abuser was shot and killed by a vigilante. Two men who targeted a man accused of watching child pornography, who ended up making a grave mistake, and parents who murdered their daughter's pimp. These are just some of the cases that we'll be looking at, so strap yourselves in. I think it's going to be a long one. A quick content/trigger warning. We're going to be discussing cases involving sexual assaults and child sexual abuse. This episode will not be appropriate for all ages, and listener discretion is advised. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 7 of the Students' Verdict podcast. Thank you for joining me on this episode. For those of you who are new, first of all, hi, my name is Emily and I'm your host. If you haven't already, please go and listen to our earlier episodes, which include cases such as that of Ronald Sanford, a man who was sentenced to 170 years in prison for a double homicide he committed when he was just 13 years old, and the disappearance of Marlene Oakes. Also, please follow us on Instagram at the Student Verdict blog and on Twitter at Student Verdict. Resources used in this episode will always be linked in the show notes. If you enjoy the episode, please rate and review. If you don't enjoy it, then keep it moving. With all that said, let's jump into today's episode. We're starting today with the story of vigilante James Fairbanks. Before we talk about him, we need to talk first about his victim, nightclub bouncer Matteo Condalucci. In 1993, Laura Smith had just moved in with Condalucci in Ormond Beach, Florida. One night, she went on a grocery store run. When she returned, she found her 5-year-old son, Anthony, crying hysterically in the bathroom. She questioned Condalucci, who claimed that the boy had wet the bed. She knew something wasn't right and left the home she shared with Condalucci the following day. As Laura and her son left, he turned to his mother and said, "Mummy, I got something I got to tell you." What she heard next would change both hers and her son's life forever. Condalucci pleaded no contest to a charge of attempted lewd and lascivious assault upon Anthony in 1994. A plea deal saw Condalucci sentenced to 4 years of probation and drug counselling. He was also put on the sex offenders register. Looking back, Smith criticised the judicial process. It was a 5-year-old man's word against a 37-year-old man's word, and he was manipulative. He was good at lying. By 2007, Condalucci had been convicted of raping a 13-year-old girl in Sarpy County, for which he was sentenced to 5 years. The 52-year-old would only serve 2.5 years before being released for good behaviour. By 2016, Smith's son, Anthony, was plagued with a fentanyl addiction. Smith believed that her son's self-medicating was to cope with the abuse he suffered as a child at the hands of Condalucci. I'm sad to say that Anthony would die of a drug overdose in 2017 at the age of just 29 years old. Around this time, Condalucci was working as a street minister. He served meals and provided free haircuts through the Disciples for Christ ministry. So how does James Fairbanks fit into this story? Well, James Fairbanks was a pretty ordinary family man, divorced with 2 children. Omaha Public Schools confirmed that Fairbanks worked at Morton Middle School from 2016 to 2018 before working at the school's Alternative Secondary Success Program. On the 18th of May, James Fairbanks posted a Facebook status with the C.S. Lewis quote, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending." Looking back, this was a foreshadowing of what was to come. Police attended Condalucci's home at 11:15 a.m. on the 16th of May after reports of a shooting were called in. Officers found Condalucci's body inside. A couple of days later, media outlets received the following letter, quote, "Dear media, I am writing this email to let you know that I killed Matteo Condalucci Thursday, May 14th, around 9:45 p.m. While out apartment searching and checking the neighborhoods I wanted to live in, I stumbled across his sex offender registry info. I read where he had molested, raped, 2 children and been convicted twice, yet only served 2 years in prison for raping children. I saw his address was right around the block from where I was looking to move. I drove by, and to my horror, he was standing in his driveway pretending to wash his truck, no soap or water, just a rag, while staring at a group of children playing in the street. I watched him for a few minutes and just felt sick to my stomach. He just kept staring at them. The kids thankfully left, and he went inside. I went to drive away and noticed to my amazement, this twice convicted sex offender had a playground set in his backyard. No fence, just a slide and a playhouse. I felt sick to my stomach. Having had my own experience with these types of predators, I knew the damage he would do to those kids. It agonized me for days. I couldn't sleep. I researched him more and more and found he had victimized dozens of kids in different states. One kid's mother had created a predator Facebook page about him, trying to warn people about him. Her son had been assaulted by him when he was 5, and the damage he did led the poor guy to die of a drug overdose years later, and his mum directly blamed that incident on him. I've worked with kids for years who have been victimized, and I couldn't, in good conscience, allow him to do it to anyone else while I had the means to stop him. I'm willing to turn myself in, even though I'm confident I wouldn't be caught, because it's my opinion that we need to fix this in our society. We cannot let this continue to happen to our children. They must be stopped. I know in this messed up judicial system, that means I will face far more severe punishment for stopping him than he did for raping kids, but I could no longer do nothing." End quote. Just to be clear, there are sources suggesting that Fairbanks turned himself in, but there are other sources that say he did not and was in fact arrested by police. Laura Smith welcomed the news of Condalucci's death. Following her experience with him, she set up a Facebook page, which Fairbanks referred to in his letter, which she utilised to warn others of Condalucci's manipulative tricks. Following Fairbanks's arrest, she focused her energy on supporting the man who killed her son's abuser, changing the page name to Free James Fairbanks. She started a change.org petition which read, quote, "James Fairbanks freely admits to murdering a paedophile who was convicted of raping 2 children and known to have molested more. For his crimes, the rapist spent 2 years in jail and went on to victimize more children. We the people stand with James Fairbanks and find his conduct reasonable." End quote. Fairbanks's family was shocked that he was capable of such action, saying that they viewed him as a protector who had worked with vulnerable children for his entire career. His ex-wife, Kelly Tomeo, said that James took it very personally to protect his kids and other kids from offenders like Condalucci. Laura Smith described Fairbanks as being similar to that of our frontline workers tackling COVID-19. She explained that he was overwhelmed and broken down after seeing so many similar experiences. She said, quote, He is our frontline worker right now when it came to the sexual abuse of children. Smith explained that she did not think Fairbanks was a bad man and that he wasn't a killer or a threat to society. She argues that Fairbanks needs a hospital and not prison. She continues to campaign for Fairbanks' release. He is currently incarcerated in Douglas County Jail. Perhaps Fairbanks' most surprising supporter was that of Condalucci's own daughter, Amanda Henry. In a comment on Smith's Free James Fairbanks page, she wrote, quote, "It's a shame they are more worried about protecting molesters than they are the children these molesters target. Our system has failed us completely." She told the World Herald, "Murdering my dad was a horrible thing, but children are much safer now. Any other child he could have hurt is much safer." She added that her father's killer should be given probation. Not everyone agreed with the sentiments of Laura Smith and Amanda Henry. The Chief Deputy Douglas County Attorney, Brenda Beadle, described Fairbanks' actions as really dangerous before charging him with first-degree murder on the 21st of May 2020. She went on to say, quote, "It's a really dangerous thing when people start taking law enforcement into their own hands. That's why we have a justice system." In stating this, she was condemning vigilantism. To be clear regarding Fairbanks' criminal background, court records show that in March 2018, Fairbanks had incurred a hefty $1,000 bill for counselling services which he had never paid. Also, his behaviour before his divorce in 2016 prompted his now ex-wife to apply for 2 protection orders. He'd been drunk in front of their children and had sent her threatening messages. There was no violence in his past. The Florida Action Committee posted their thoughts on the Condalucci case. They said that the Omaha media had, quote, "all but canonized the murderer, making him a sympathetic character, while the registrant he killed was not a sympathetic character. This has led to an outpouring of support for the murderer." They rejected this portrayal of James Fairbanks, saying that the backstory to the case was not of any relevance, and that the bottom line was that this was an act of premeditated murder by someone who had accessed the sex offender register to track down Condalucci. They described Fairbanks' actions as a cold, calculated killing. The group suggested that people contact the Douglas County DA's office requesting that Fairbanks' bail application be denied. They urged people to report the Change.org petition requesting that the president pardon James Fairbanks. Similarly, they urged people to demand that all GoFundMe accounts set up in support of James Fairbanks be rejected. I've checked, and it does seem that all of the GoFundMes have been removed. I couldn't find any. The group also recommended that people contact Nebraskans Unafraid and offer support. This is a group which believes the right to safety should also extend to those on the register. They also educate the public about how to achieve safe communities. Finally, the article recommended that Laura Smith's Facebook page be reported as a hate group for its threatening comments. To make sure that you hear both sides, I'm just going to read the About section on Laura Smith's Facebook page. And this is a quote. "This is not a hate group. This group represents a gathering of people seeking justice for James Fairbanks. We believe Mr. Fairbanks specifically is not guilty of murder. We believe James felt it a matter of personal duty to protect the children of his community, and James Fairbanks specifically was entirely justified in doing what many of us, both in the same community and on our own, had to be done. The individual executed in this case shall not be named here. We in no way advocate, support, or by any subtext encourage any other acts of violence, regardless of any similarity to this case. To repeat, this is not a hate group. We all understand that these are extremely sensitive issues. Discussion of life and death and sexual assault and child molestation is, by its very nature, revolting, as it should be. These topics raise rage and intense emotion that, while often entirely valid, is counterproductive here. We have a goal. We seek justice for Mr. James Fairbanks. As such, we cannot and will not permit any hate speech or violent speech that seeks to attach itself to our cause. Please understand we will remove these statements and the people who continually make them as fast as we can. This is not insensitivity or defending anybody who victimizes children or anybody else. This is a focused effort to #FreeJamesFairbanks. Inspiring a hate group, even against vile people, is extremely counterproductive to that effort. Please take care to keep any demonstration on behalf of James Fairbanks or this group civil and decent. The comment section of the Florida Action Committee's article, which I read, was mixed and quite heated. Some vehemently believed that Condoleezza got what he deserved, whilst others condemned the actions of James Fairbanks and believed he should rot in prison. As it currently stands, James Fairbanks has entered pleas of not guilty, which have been accepted by the court. He is currently awaiting trial. This will be a case that I will definitely be following. And now here is a quick trailer for a great podcast, Hot Takes and Beer Breaks. Please follow them on social media and give their podcast a listen. Why not leave them a review as well?
Hello, everyone. I'm John, host of the new podcast, Hot Takes and Beer Breaks, where I'm joined by two of my best friends, Justin and Jason, to give our hottest takes on current events, entertainment, movies, and sports, all while going on wild tangents, making cheesy puns, and having a good laugh. Listen to us wherever you get your podcast and find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Hot Takes and Beer Breaks, where we have some hot takes, but more beer breaks.
Our next case starts with a man by the name of Timothy Carl Chandler. Chandler lived on Butler Lane, a one-lane country road in Helenwood, a small town 15 miles south of the Kentucky border. Helenwood has a population of around 800 people. It's a rural mountain community with rolling fields, small weathered houses, outbuildings, and trailers. Chandler lived here with his wife, Melissa. In 2007, 53-year-old Timothy Chandler was arrested on child pornography charges. His mother-in-law had found some pictures of young girls on a disk he had loaned to her in May to copy computer programs onto. She notified authorities, and Chandler was arrested on the 20th of August. He was released on a $100,000 bond and eventually came home. Chandler's name was splashed across the headlines, which brought some very unwanted attention. Two of the Chandler's neighbours, 37-year-old construction worker Robert Bell and 39-year-old coal mining equipment mechanic Gary Sellers, decided they didn't want Timothy Chandler living in their town anymore, as he was, as they described him, a pervert. It was then that they hatched a plan to scare Timothy Chandler. Their goal, they say, was to scare him into leaving for good. On the 2nd of September 2007, they set fire to the Chandler's small rented house which they had lived in for approximately 8 years. Timothy Chandler was able to escape his burning home. His wife, 37-year-old Melissa, was unfortunately not so lucky. When Chandler brought his wife out of the house, she was unconscious. He attempted CPR on her, but Melissa would later die at the emergency room. Timothy Chandler told Knoxville Television, quote, "I really wish it wasn't me who got out. I wish it was her. She didn't deserve that." Oma Butler owned the one-bedroom home which she rented to the Chandlers. She recalled how the couple were secretive, but how they had always been nice to her and were good renters. Butler recalled being woken by the sound of tires spinning. When she looked outside, she saw a red pickup truck drive up to a nearby hill, park and turn off its lights. It was her son who alerted her that the Chandlers' house was on fire. Her son then ran to the property, smashing a window to help Timothy Chandler get out. They then broke open a door so Chandler could get his wife, but it was too late. Sellers and Bell told police that they had not intended for anyone to die, that they had just wanted Chandler out of the neighborhood. Sellers admitted that he had driven the pickup truck that was used that night, but it was Bell who had set the fire. Once the fire had been lit, both men drove off in the pickup, finding a spot where they could watch the house burn. Leif Jeffers, Bell's lawyer, said that his client felt it was, quote, an unfortunate incident. For background purposes, Chandler, Bell, and Sellers were all known to the police. Chandler had served 18 months in Ohio for the offense of gross sexual imposition, for which he was convicted in 1990. Bell and Sellers had been caught for a number of fairly minor driving offences. Outside the Scott County courtroom, Timothy Chandler said, quote, "It is unbelievable that anybody would do that. Anybody can be charged with anything and not do it. And then be burned out? That is the worst thing I could think of." Having lost everything in the fire, Timothy Chandler was forced to move into a Knoxville homeless shelter. This case was an example of vigilantism geared towards punishing a sex offender, but it was Melissa Chandler, an innocent party, who got caught up and who paid the ultimate price. Her sister, Melinda Lindsay, attended Bell and Sellers' court hearings, wearing a t-shirt with a picture of her sister's face. She of course blamed Sellers and Bell for their part in her sister's death, but she also blamed her brother-in-law Timothy for being, as she described him, a sick individual. She expressed regret for not having persuaded her sister to leave Chandler after his 1990 conviction, where the female victims were then aged 1 and 4. Our next case of vigilantism is that of Stephen Marshall. Stephen Marshall was born in Fort Worth, Texas on the 9th of August 1985. He then moved with his family to, I'm going to say Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. I'm really sorry to anyone who lives there if I'm butchering the name. His parents would then divorce in 1996. In 1999, Marshall moved to Cul-de-sac, Idaho with his father Ralph, who served 3 years as mayor. Stephen Marshall had some pretty serious problems when he was young. In April 2001, when Marshall was 15 years old, he was charged with aggravated assault after he brought an AR-15 rifle onto his lawn where 2 kids were fighting. When his father moved to Arizona and later to Maine, Marshall moved back to his mother's house in Cape Breton during the summer of 2003. Stephen Marshall's vigilante journey began like so many others, with the Sex Offender Registry, which is publicly available. The registry contains very personal information, including the names and addresses of convicted sex offenders. It also includes, sometimes, photos, identifying characteristics, and even their place of employment. It's actually one of the state government's most popular websites, with around 200,000 hits a month. Marshall noted down the details of 29 out of 34 sex offenders listed on the main registry before deciding to take a trip to visit his father, who was by now living in Maine. It was during the early hours of Easter Sunday in 2006 when 20-year-old Marshall left his mother's home in Nova Scotia to travel to Maine, near the Canada-US border. During his journey to Maine, Marshall's car broke down, so, in the early hours, he slipped out of his bedroom window and borrowed his father's truck, without his father's permission. It's said that he also took a .45 caliber handgun with him. It should be noted that other sources suggest that Stephen Marshall had 3 guns with him, in fact. That night, armed with the guns and the addresses obtained from the registry, Marshall travelled 2 hours southwest, reaching the town of Milo at around 3 a.m. 57-year-old Joseph Gray was in the living room. He'd fallen asleep on the sofa after watching forensic files with his wife. His wife's sleep was disturbed by her dogs barking. It's likely that they were spooked by an intruder, Stephen Marshall. Marshall shot and killed Gray through the living room window as his wife stood by, helpless. Marshall then fled the scene. It's believed he drove to the residence of 4 other sex offenders before reaching the address of 24-year-old William Elliott at around 8 a.m. In what I think is a bold move, Marshall actually knocked on the door of Elliott's home, and when William Elliott opened the door, Marshall shot him and continued to do so even after Elliott had fallen to the floor. Awoken by the shots, William Elliott's girlfriend saw the Toyota truck pulling out of the driveway and was able to note down the number plate. With this number plate, police were able to trace the vehicle back to Stephen Marshall's father. Investigators knew that Stephen Marshall had accessed the sex offenders register because he had typed his own name in to receive additional information, including street addresses. The register was temporarily removed but was then reinstated. A criminal defense lawyer by the name of Jack King said that making the addresses of sex offenders available to the public was, as he put it, an invitation to violence. So what became of Stephen Marshall? Marshall attempted to board a bus that evening. However, when police stopped the bus to arrest Stephen Marshall, he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Let me tell you, our next vigilante is a special one, Michael Mullen. Mullen found his victims on a sheriff's department website. He tracked down 3 known sex offenders, all living at one address. 49-year-old Hank Eases, 68-year-old Victor Vasquez, and 42-year-old James A. Russell. Mullen attended the address on the 26th of August 2005, posing as a federal agent. He even went as far as to wear a black baseball cap with the FBI insignia and a dark blue jumpsuit. According to Mullen, he told the men they were on a hit list and were in danger. He discussed their crimes with them, trying to get an understanding of how remorseful they were. One of the men, Russell, would eventually leave for work. When he returned, he found his roommates dead, with single gunshot wounds to their heads. After the murders, 36-year-old Mullen telephoned 911 in Bellingham to confess and then handed himself in. He was arraigned in Whatcom County Superior Court on the 6th of September 2005, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Mullen would admit to authorities that he had been plotting the murder for a while, after he was particularly upset by a criminal case involving a repeated sex offender. Joseph E. Duncan III was accused of murdering 3 members of the Groan family with a hammer during a home invasion. His plan was to abduct the 2 youngest children, Shasta, who was 8, and her brother Dylan, 9. Duncan had spotted the 2 children out playing as he drove past their house. The bodies of Brenda Groan, her boyfriend, and their 13-year-old son were found in the home. Dylan's body was found 2 days after his sister was discovered safe. The case angered Mullen because Duncan had a long history as a violent sexual predator, having committed his first recorded sexual offense in 1978, 27 years before the Groan family murders. Lieutenant Ambrose said that when speaking to Michael Mullen, it was clear, quote, he was upset that a sex offender killed a family and abducted the kids. He said that a couple of times. That was one of the things that may have triggered this. On another occasion, Mullen expressed a desire to execute his victims as soon as possible, so that he could wait in the afterlife to wreak vengeance on the man whose crimes he said drove him to kill. That man was Joseph Edward Duncan III. Regarding Mullen's victims, I'd like to make it clear here that corrections officials had been satisfied with the progress of Mr. Isis, Mr. Vasquez, and Mr. Russell. About them, officials said, quote, "They were what we called a success story. They had lived there for a number of years, and although neighbours were not particularly happy about it, they all knew them. There had been no community problems, and they had not reoffended." Michael Mullen wrote a series of letters to various media outlets explaining his actions. In his letters, Mullen said that he attended the victim's address to interview Isis, the homeowner, because he wanted to know why he did what he did. Upon arriving, he checked the identities of the 3 men, who were all level 3 sex offenders. Isis had served 5.5 years in prison for the rape of a 13-year-old boy. He'd been released in 2003. Vasquez was convicted of molesting several children in 1991. It should be noted that Mullen himself had a long history of drug and alcohol abuse and criminal convictions for forgery and theft. Mullen wrote that he killed Victor Vasquez and Hank Isis because they, quote, blamed their victims. They showed no remorse. Mullen would later tell his brother Larry that Vasquez and Isis were bragging about their crimes to him. But Larry didn't think that made much sense. Why would they brag to an FBI agent about their crimes? Mullen claimed that he didn't kill the 3rd roommate because he expressed remorse for his crimes. But in his letters, he wrote, quote, "I wanted one alive to spread the message that we will not tolerate our children being used and abused." In another letter posted online, Mullen confessed to the crime again. He claimed that he was abused as a child. He told the Times that this was partly what drove him to take the law into his own hands. "Don't get me wrong, I am no saint. I've been haunted since childhood. I just don't want other children to grow up confused, sad, and scared. I am not proud of taking 2 lives. I would have gladly just gave my own. But my death alone would have meant nothing. Some of these children grow up to be drunks, addicts, thieves, or act out sexually, sometimes becoming paedophiles themselves." Shortly after the double murder, letters were sent to a newspaper and television station in Bellingham. The letters warned that more sex offenders would die. The authorities took the letters seriously. Their content suggested there was a conspiracy against sex offenders. The fear was that maybe there was more than one vigilante out there. Authorities advised sex offenders to screen any unknown visitors who came to their homes and to request formal identification. Kit Bale, the regional administrator for the Washington Department of Corrections, said, quote, "We are letting them know about the potential threats and giving them some perspective on what can make them safe." In 2006, Michael Mullen would be sentenced to 44 years in prison after being convicted for the double murder of Vasquez and Isis. The Whatcom County prosecutor, Mac Setter, said Mullen's excuse for the killings, his victims' lack of remorse, was only self-serving justification. It was the prosecution's position that Mullen planned to kill those men all along, regardless of whether they had been remorseful or not. In Setter's words, quote, he, Mullen, is trying to justify these killings to make it sound like these men had some sort of choice in their deaths, that he interviewed them and they failed his test by not being remorseful. They did not. He intended to kill them from the outset. Having served just 1 year of his sentence, it was clear from correspondence that Mullen was not adjusting well. And on the 15th of April 2007, Michael Mullen was found unresponsive in his cell at Stafford Creek Correction Centre. He was declared dead 2 hours later at Grays Harbor Community Hospital. On the 15th of September 2007, the county coroner, Ed Fleming, issued the following statement, quote, Michael Mullen, a Stafford Creek Corrections Centre inmate who died in April, was determined to have died of pneumonia, but the manner of death is undetermined because acute mild drug toxicity is a contributing factor. This case was called one of the nation's worst cases of vigilantism against sex offenders. It could be argued that Vasquez and Ises were scapegoats for the targets of Mullen's hatred, his abuser, and Joseph E. Duncan. And now we've arrived at our final case. Well done for getting this far, but I think this case will be worth it as it's one of the most controversial vigilante cases, I think, and will definitely divide opinion. Our case starts with Barry Laprelle Gilton, Lupe Mercado, and their daughter, who, as she was a juvenile at the time, is referred to only as LG, so that's how I'll refer to her. 8 months prior to the incident, LG had moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles for a new start. She claimed to have been living with her older brother, Antonio Gilton, who was in fact her cousin. In Los Angeles, LG had met and began dating an older man, 22-year-old Calvin Sneed, despite being underage herself. LG learned that her new boyfriend Sneed had been pimping young women for prostitution in the LA area, and so she began to advertise herself on various prostitution websites. Lupe and Barry were heartbroken when they learned what their daughter was up to in LA. They begged her to stop prostituting, leave Sneed, and come home, but she refused. The parents tried to go to law enforcement, but without much success. They also registered her as a juvenile runaway, but it all seemed to be in vain. The parents believed that Sneed had pushed their daughter into a life of prostitution, and if they could just get her away from him, things would get better. On the 27th of May, the couple travelled from the Bay Area to LA, where they found Calvin Sneed in North Hollywood. It was alleged that they fired shots into his car, but that they only wounded him. On the 31st of May 2012, the couple travelled to Los Angeles again, hoping to persuade their daughter to return to San Francisco. LG refused to return with her parents. 3 days later, on the 4th of June, LG and her boyfriend Sneed travelled together to San Francisco, where Sneed dropped LG off at her parents' house at around 4 p.m. LG stayed with her parents until around midnight, when she texted Sneed to come and pick her up. This brought on a row. The same row the family had had multiple times. The couple wanted their daughter to stay. They hated the idea of her returning to a life of forced sex work. But the more her parents protested, the more defiant LG became. Out of anger, Barry Laprelle told his daughter that she was grown and instructed her to switch off the lights before she left. At 1:56 a.m., LG was waiting for Sneed outside her parents' home and noticed a silver SUV parked nearby with its lights on. As Sneed's car arrived, the silver SUV pulled away, but as Sneed drove past where LG was standing and turned the corner, the SUV reappeared and accelerated towards Sneed's vehicle. Suddenly, there were gunshots and flashes coming from the silver SUV. There was a crash, and LG found her boyfriend, Calvin Sneed, slumped in the driver's seat with a gunshot wound to his head. Later that day, police received confidential information implicating LG's father, Barry, and a second unidentified person in Calvin Sneed's murder. DA George Gascon said he, quote, understood the frustration that the parents must have felt, but taking the law into your own hands is not an acceptable solution. Charles Sneed, the victim's father, said he knew that his son had been involved in things he shouldn't have been, but that this didn't give anyone the right to take his life. Call him a pimp, call him a gangbanger, paint the picture as worse as you want. The fact of the matter is, he didn't deserve to die. That's the bottom line. Barry Laprelle Gilton and Lupe Mercado were both charged with 1 count of murder, 1 count of discharging a firearm into an occupied motor vehicle, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. Gilton was also charged with 1 count of possession of a firearm as a felon because of a 1995 drug-related conviction. Erica Sapphire, the couple's attorney, told the media that the parents were facing a nightmare and they were just trying to protect their daughter. Mercado's lawyer, Tony Tambrello, criticized law enforcement officials for jumping to the conclusion that because the couple wouldn't miss Calvin Sneed, that they were the ones who killed him, but they denied this was the case. It was suggested that Sneed, a known gang member, was conducting business in a foreign gang area, which may have made him a target. This case certainly divides opinion, and it's easy to see why. But is it really down to a member of the public to act as judge, jury, and executioner? Charles Sneed said that he had tried to help his son to turn his life around, but that now he'd never get the chance. He told reporters, quote, "It's a sad thing. It's a sad thing for my family. It's a sad thing for the girl's family. It's just sad all the way round." In this episode, we've looked at a number of cases of vigilantism. Each vigilante had their own motive, whether it was clear or not, and each one of the cases we've discussed had a very different outcome from the last, and yet there was an overarching theme of sexual offences. That's because the types of crimes discussed in this episode evoke strong feelings, which some people then act on. The motives of Michael Mullen, Belen Sellers, and James Fairbanks were clear, and I think they would have done anything to achieve their individual goals. However, in the case of Barry Laprelle Gilton and Lupe Mercado, I don't think Calvin Sneed had to die. I don't think this couple would have taken the law into their own hands if authorities had helped them get their daughter back. In any event, regardless of the vigilante's backstory or the backstory of their target, is it for an individual to act as judge, jury, and executioner? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please tweet me at Student Verdict or join our Facebook group by searching the Students Verdict podcast. And that's the end of today's episode on vigilantism. I urge you to follow the James Fairbanks case. I think it'll be interesting to see how the court system deals with Mr. Fairbanks if he's found guilty. I don't know whether they'll be more lenient or whether they'll throw the book at him to make an example of him. Maybe a jury will sympathise and will deliver a verdict of not guilty. We'll have to see. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. The Students' Verdict is a bi-weekly podcast, so follow us on all social media to hear about our next episode. The Students' Verdict can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, Spreaker, and Google Play. While you're there, why not check out Hot Takes and Beer Breaks as well? I'll see you on the next one. Remember to keep living the dream.